Alrighty, I think we are going to begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our December History Talks. Thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you for the folks watching and joining us from home over Zoom. I just want to say I can't believe the next time we meet for History Talks, it's already going to be 2024. The year has flown by. Has it flown by for anyone else, or does anyone feel like it's been so fast? Yeah. I agree. Okay, so if you haven't already, we'd love for you to sign in on our sign-up sheet over there. That's just for us to get an accurate count of how many people came in person today. You don't have to do that right now. You can do it after the talk. You can also use that form to sign up for our newsletter. My name is Felicia, and I'm the museum coordinator for the Lacey Museum. For tonight's program, we are joined by author and historian Drew Crooks. Drew will be sharing the history of Hudson's Bay Company official William Fraser Tolmie. And before we dive in, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement and some museum news. The Lacey Museum is on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Nisqually Indian Tribe and Squaxin Island Tribe. We acknowledge and remember those tribal people not recognized today who were absorbed or relocated into other tribes for survival. We recognize the ancestors and their descendants who are still here. We recognize and respect the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek as the traditional stewards of this land since time immemorial, and their role today in taking care of these lands in perpetuity. We recognize and have the responsibility to call attention to the histories of dispossession, forced removal, and abridged treaty rights that allowed our nation, state, and city to develop as they have today. We recommend that community members read the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854. Okay, as always, we'd love to see you at the museum. We are open Thursdays and Fridays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., Saturdays, 10 to 4. Come on in, request a tour. We would be happy to provide you one. We do have our Smithsonian poster exhibit called Journey Stories still up at the museum. The exhibit explores how movement has shaped our nation with a look at American expansion and migration, from the earliest settlers and Native American displacement to the effects of transportation on modern mobility. We are also selling Thurston County historical journals after the completion of tonight's program. If you are interested, those will be available on the back table. We can take card or cash payment, and these are also available at the museum for purchase. Coming up next month, we hope you join us for our January History Talk with former City of Lacey Mayor and Council Member Karen Fraser. Karen will share her experiences navigating her roles in a young city, its changing form of government, the building of City Hall, and the formation of the Lacey Museum. Okay, so now for tonight's presentation, as always, we will hold our Q&A section at the end. We will do our best to get questions from our in-person and online attendees. So for those online, if you do have questions you can think of during the presentation, feel free to submit those by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those in person, I will be coming around with a microphone, so just raise your hand and I'll come to you. It is important that we give you the microphone so folks at home can hear your questions. Now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Drew Crooks. Drew received a bachelor's degree in history and anthropology and a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Washington. For over 35 years, he has worked with various museums of the South Puget Sound, written numerous articles and 5 books on the region's heritage, and presented history talks to school classes and community groups. Thank you, Drew, for being with us tonight.
Okay. Thank you. Well, hello. I am very pleased to be here today, honored. To me, history is important, And it's nice to see people out and hopefully online listening to this too. And first off, I'd like to start off by saying that I couldn't do this without a number of people. And first off, I'd like to thank Felicia and Aaron Quinvalcho and the Lacey Museum for having me here tonight. And I also like to thank three people who are now passed away, but they were great Hudson's Bay Company historians, and I think they should be remembered. And I'm thinking of Del McBride, who did great work on local history. Cecilia Carpenter, who was the Nisqually tribal historian. And one person that probably is less known, Joe Huntsman, who patiently transcribed and printed up copies of some of the journals and early accounts of Fort Nisqually. I also like to thank the State Library, the State Archives, and other institutions that preserve this information and make it available. Some of them are under siege, you might say, like even the State Archives with the flooding, but they still preserve and make available much good, really good information. Oftentimes in history, we think about, can one person make a difference? And sometimes you can say yes, sometimes no. But in this case, William Fraser Tolmie, I think you can say yes. He's one person that lived a very long time ago, born in 1812 and died in 1886. But that what he did here in the Northwest set a legacy that still affects us today. William Fraser Tolmie, first off, you have to know he was a Scot. Born in Scotland in 1812 in Inverness. If you look on this map, you can see Inverness. It's considered by some the capital of the Scottish Highlands. It's up in the north, and it's a medium, well, fairly good-sized city, and has a lot of history. But William Fraser Tolmie was born there on February 3rd, 1812, to Alexander Tolmie and Marjorie Fraser Tolmie. Sadly, his mother, William's mother, died when he was 3. He was raised by an aunt, and later he talked about it a little bit. He didn't talk much about his early life. It was a difficult upbringing. She was not a particularly kind person, the aunt that raised him. But when he went to the local schools, he showed great promise. And one thing to remember about Tolmie, he was an extremely intelligent person. And in the local schools there, he did very well. And so an uncle saw promise in him and knows that William Tolmie was interested in medicine. So he paid for him to go to Glasgow, the University of Glasgow. And he studied there. And I want to get this right. There's Inverness today. He did not get a doctor's degree. He was never called an MD, medical degree. In those days, he got a diploma at his licentiate from the Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. And when you read his accounts, the medicine he knew, boy, is not what we would want today. But for that time period, it was very advanced. He graduated with his diploma. Suddenly, he had some illness, serious illness. And he did recover from it. We don't know much about it. He never talked about it. But he recovered from it. And just then in Glasgow, they had a cholera epidemic. So he worked as a clerk, not as a doctor, but as a clerk at one of the cholera hospitals. And it must have been a horrendous experience for him. And in a way, that fall in 1832, at the age of 20, he made this decision. Instead of staying in Scotland he decided to go to another place. And so he joined the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, how many of you know what the Hudson's Bay Company is? Do you guys have a pretty good idea? I have a feeling most of you that would come tonight would have a pretty good idea. I won't go into too much detail, but basically it was a British corporation. This is their coat of arms. Formed, I like this picture, formed in 1670. A charter signed by King Charles II for a company of investors or adventurers to set up fur trading posts in the New World at, well, Hudson's Bay, up in what is now Canada. And so they set up the system, and in the New World, they established trading posts across what is now Canada and into the Pacific Northwest. And in most cases, Native Americans would capture the furs and trade at these posts with the Euro-American workers there. They trade with the posts for trade goods, ranging from blankets to muskets to anything that would be useful to them. And in the Pacific Northwest, now I don't want to make this too complicated, after 1821, they came down in the Pacific Northwest. And it was called the Columbia District with headquarters at Fort Vancouver. And the man who was in charge of Fort Vancouver was John McLaughlin, known as the White Eagle because of how he looked with his white hair, and a very distinct individual. Anyway, Tolmie was sent over, he signed a contract to work for 5 years. Now he's 20 years old. 5 years and to work in the New World, and he was sent to the Pacific Northwest. And in those days, the way to go would be by ship, of course, and it would be around around the Cape, coming up to Hawaiian Islands and then the Pacific Northwest. And Tolmie, because he was such a dedicated, capable person, though not known for a sense of humor, but still a very hardworking person, he made use of his time and studied seabirds and learned different languages as he came out. And so he came to this is young Tolmie. It's one of the rare pictures we have him as a young man. He came to the Northwest, and he came to Fort Vancouver. And John McLaughlin and the Hudson's Bay Company, they were all business. They didn't say, well, you have a long sea voyage, take off a couple of weeks, see the countryside, rest up. No, they say, get to work. And so they sent him up to post Fort McLaughlin on the British Columbia coast. But to get there, he went overland in the beginning, came to Puget Sound, and he came to a place called Nisqually. Now, it's not the Nisqually River. It was given the name Nisqually. It's at DuPont, the city of DuPont. And he was just stayed there. He was supposed to be there just a short time, get on a ship, and head up to the British Columbia coast. Now, let's talk about this temporary post, at that point called Nisqually House. And the Nisqually House was a trading post, very temporary, and it was on the location of the mouth of the Sequalitou Creek as they entered Puget Sound. And this is what it looks like today. I imagine it looked quite different back in 1833. On the south side, the far side of the creek, was a small Native American village, the Nisqually Sequalitou Band, and right next to it was a temporary HBC post, which was quite small, just a handful of people. And Tolmie came up with Archibald MacDonald, and they were going to make a more permanent post, kind of solidify their position. And one thing I want to mention, there's no way on earth they could have lived here if they didn't have the active cooperation of the Native Americans. This is not a case of one group pushing out another group. This is a case of Euro-Americans coming to work with Native Americans, because the Native Americans were their customers and their partners in business, and sometimes they married Native Americans too. So family ties too. So the village was right next to this temporary post, right next to it. So they got along pretty good. Well, Tolmie thought he was going to go right on up to the British Columbia coast. But what happened instead was that one of the chief laborers, an interesting character named Pierre Charles, who I've written about, and you can do a whole talk on Pierre Charles, he hurt himself. He was cutting wood with an axe, and he sliced into his foot. Bad cut. One of the things, if you look at the diary of Tolmie, he writes in great detail about this, probably more detail than we want to know. But so Charles was one of the few people that could hunt for wild game. He was a very capable person. They couldn't lose him. To lose him would be a loss to that whole operation. So Tolmie stayed. He didn't take the ship up. He stayed at Nisqually for 9 months in 1833. And he did successfully treat Pierre Charles, who went on to live many more years, did many more things. And so Tolmie was there. And so while there, he explored the area. He learned a lot more about the Native Americans, the natural history. One of the most interesting things he did at this time was he was into botany and collecting botanical specimens and sending them back to England. And so he went on a botanical expedition up near Mount Rainier. Now, some people say he was going to try to climb the mountain. Maybe so, but he didn't succeed in that. But he did succeed in collecting different plants. And today, and we'll talk more about later, Tolmie Peak is named for him, which is right near Mount Rainier. And this is a view from Tolmie Peak towards the mountain. Anyway, he explored. He learned a lot more about the country. He learned more about working with people, with the Hudson's Bay Company. And then, after 9 months, a ship came, and he went on north up to British Columbia. Well, it wasn't BC then, though. Now, this is a leather trunk that belonged to Tolmie that's now at the Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. And the next couple years, even though he stayed a while in different places, is almost like a transitional period, because he worked at different posts along the BC coast. He worked at Fort Vancouver. He did a lot of different things. And then in 1841, he had a chance for what they call a furlough, a vacation, a break from the company. And so he went back to Europe. He went back to Scotland. And it was not an easy trip, because here he is on the northwest coast. There's not a ship that's going to take him around the Cape. He's got to go across the continent. And he went overland up to York Factory on Hudson's Bay, and then by ship that way to England. And once in England and Scotland, he used his time well. He studied medicine more in France, in Paris. He met his relatives again. And some people, when they do a furlough, well, they never come back. You know what I mean? They went home, they're home. He was loyal, and he wanted to continue in the Northwest. He continued with the Hudson's Bay Company. And one of the main characteristics of Tolmie was that when he believed in something, he was loyal right to the end. And some of the choices he made were actually personally quite dangerous to him. We'll find out later. Okay, so he sent back. And on his trip back, which was by sea this time, coming back again, he's learning Spanish. Because he thought, and they must have mentioned it to him, that he was going to be assigned to a small town in California called Yerba Buena on San Francisco Bay. and later the town becomes San Francisco. So he said he was going to go, and this would be like the mid-1840s. He was going to be sent, he thought, to the Hudson's Bay Company trading post, more like a store, in what became San Francisco, right before the gold rush. So when he comes to the Columbia River, Fort Vancouver, the Northwest, McLaughlin says, "You're not going to California. You're going to Nisqually." He was shocked. He was shocked. And to me, this is kind of some of the choices in history that things could have been very, very different. I wonder how Tolmie would have done during the gold rush in California. Anyway, who knows? So he goes back to Nisqually. And the first job he has is he's to move, by this point, the post on the beach, the temporary Nisqually house, that had been moved in 1833 up to what we, with great imagination, called the 1833 Fort Nisqually, and near Old Fort Lake. And but when Tolmie came back in 1843, he's told the fort needs to be moved again. That was your first mission, to move the fort. And he moved the fort from Old Fort Lake. And if you look, you see something called Civic Center. That's the DuPont City Hall. Just on the other side of Center Drive, there's kind of an open area. That's the 1843 fort. It's 1 mile inland from the 1833 fort and south of the Sequaliture Creek. And he's supposed to move the post up there. And when you move the post, it's like moving a lot of the buildings up. You take them apart, you move them up. You rebuild them. You also build new buildings too. And it was a major job. And the reason he moved was not just, McLaughlin liked people moving all the time to different stores or something. It was a reason for better access to the water supply at Sequaliture Creek and for better farming. There's more access to farming area. This is what the post looked like about 1845. And so this is the 1843 fort after it's moved. Now, this is a later picture. Please disregard the post in the back and focus your attention on the livestock, the cows and the sheep. The Hudson's Bay Company, when we think of them most of the time now, we think of them as trading furs, animal furs, with the Native American, sending the furs back to Europe and trading trade goods with Native Americans. Now, the truth is, the fur trade, at least locally in Puget Sound, went downhill very quickly. And they continued to trade furs to the closure of the post in 1870. But by 1843, fur trading was way down. So even while continuing to do fur trading, they had to do something else to make money. And they decided to go into farming. And they created what they called the Puget Sound Agricultural Company, PSAC. And I guess you could call it corporate farming. They raised livestock, sheep, cattle. They grew wheat. They grew crops. And in those days, they used some for their own post to eat, but they traded all across around the Pacific. Some were sent back to Europe. Most were traded like to Spanish, then Mexican California, the Hawaiian Islands, and then also up to Russian Alaska. It's really hard to get a picture of farmers working in 1845. They didn't do sketches of them. This is an artistic license. This is an artist, Parker McAllister, who drew it more like in 1953 of PSAC, HBC people shearing sheep. And the one thing I want to mention that when Tolmie was there, he was not working with a group of Scots. He was working with a handful of people from Europe. He was working with a very multicultural, multi-ethnic group. It's the most amazing diversity you've ever seen. Once I was doing some research on Edward Lang, an artist, and I contacted the library in Queens, New York. And the person I talked to sounded like she was from Jamaica. And so I was reading about Queens, and I was curious, and I found in Jamaica there's people from all over the world that live in Jamaica. I mean, live in Queens. And so here at the Hudson's Bay Company, it was the same thing. It was true. There was Scots, Irish, English. There were French Canadians. There were Hawaiians. There were African Americans. There were even American settlers. There were a lot of Native Americans, not just the local tribe, but people from all over North America. Pierre Charles, for example, he's not from the Northwest. He's from near Montreal. He's an Abenaki, full-blooded Abenaki Indian. There are also people of Métis, or mixed blood, both Native American and Euro-American background. And so working together with all these languages, it kind of made sense that Tolmie was an expert on languages. Anyway, so here's some, they're working. And one thing that Tolmie did was he did not just supervise the Fort Nisqually post when he was here. He also supervised a whole system of what they called outstations. I find that word kind of unfortunate because I've mentioned it in some talks and they think it's like outhouse. No, it's not an outhouse. Outstation is like a satellite farm. It's like a separate farm with its own building away from Fort Nisqually. Because the farming they did was all the way from the Puyallup River down to the Nisqually River, and even south here in the Thurston County some, like at Tennequa. Anyway, on this map of farming stations, there's just some of them there. Tolmie was in charge of all of them. He was in charge of all of them. During his time here, he was a very efficient manager. And that's the thing to remember. He was an efficient, capable businessman. He knew how to handle people and work with people, all different types. He's one of the few early Euro-Americans to come that bothered to learn Lushootseed. He spoke it fluently, the native language. This is a fairly early picture, 1860 of him. A very capable manager. While he was at Fort Nisqually from 1843 to 1859. During that time, he moved ahead professionally. He was made a chief trader in 1847 and what they call a chief factor, very high office in the HBC in 1855. But also, his personal life changed too. On the left is Jane Wark Tolmie, when she was quite young, circa 1850. She married William Tolmie, okay? Now, and to me, one thing, she's a very interesting person. We don't know too much about her, but her father was an Irish HBC official. Her mother was Suzette Lugacy Wark, was French Canadian and Native American. Now, what's interesting is the woman to the woman to the right, Letitia Wark Huggins, is the sister of Jane Wark. And Letitia married in the 1850s. William Tolmie married in 1850. Shortly afterward, Edward Huggins, who was the right-hand man of Tolmie at Fort Nisqually, married the sister of Jane. He married Letitia. And the way to think of this is the HBC world is almost like a clan. And there's a lot of intermarriage and families intermarriage. And it helped that John Wark had lots of daughters, too. But Jane Wark Tolmie was, and William Tolmie had a close, successful marriage for many years. And they had 5 daughters and 7 sons. So it was the age of big families. But the thing that I think that made Tolmie such a remarkable individual, such an interesting character, was the fact that he was at Fort Nisqually at a time of crucial change and encounter between different peoples. And on one hand, he had his own workforce, but I won't talk too much about that. But on the other hand would be the Native Americans of the region. And this is a map I like from the University of Victoria that shows some of the tribes, some of the groups there. When Tolmie worked with the Native Americans, it was some of the Native Americans were relatives they had married into by Hudson's Bay Company men. They were customers. They would come and trade furs and other items and buy things at the store that they had at Fort Nisqually. And they were workers at the post, both long-term and short-term. And they came from many different tribes, particularly the Nisqually and the Puyallup, but from other tribes too. One of the things that astounded me when I did research on HBC is when you look at the records, I'm used to looking at records and they say, well, here we have 3 Native Americans who worked on the farm. You know, this is like a Euro-American farm. And Big John, Little Joe, and Tom. Well, they didn't do that with the Hudson's Bay Company. They had their native names. Now, sometimes they had nicknames too, or they had nicknames, but I would say 80–90% it was their native name. Now, unfortunately, the company officials couldn't spell for the life of them, and how to spell a name in a language that's totally different, it's hard. So you get a lot of variation. But it shows kind of a working relationship. And I'm not saying there was no racism. There was racism. There was probably personal disagreements, etc. It wasn't a paradise. But you had the sense of people from different cultures and groups working together. And Cecilia Carpenter was particularly strong on how she felt that the Nisqually people and the Hudson's Bay Company people got along well. In fact, she was a descendant, I should say, of an HBC worker and Native American and Nisqually woman. Now, the thing is, the HBC definitely influenced the culture of the people here and the way of life. And, but a lot of their culture and what they did not particularly care to interfere with. They didn't really, there was a lot of interaction between the two. It makes you wonder if the system would have lasted longer, how the history of this region would have been different, but who's to say? A lot of the noted leaders, like the famous Chief Leshai, Quaymuth, worked for the Hudson Bay Company. They were friends of the HBC. We'll talk about that a little bit later on that point. But the Native American, Tolmie had a remarkable way of working with Native Americans. And I think that made him really a remarkable person for that time period. Now, the other group that makes Tolmie, I think, a remarkable individual was his ability to work with what I call American settlers. I know people have different names for them. We just recently had a discussion on this by email with different historians, but I go with American settlers, and they were individuals that came from the East Coast and Midwest. I like to say the poor people came by Oregon Trail, the rich came by ship. And this is from Harper's Ferry. I always like this. I guess they're stopping for lunch. And I think one thing to remember about them is that to leave their homes in the East and to give everything up, literally give everything up except just basic things, and to come out here shows how, I don't want to use the word desperate, but how serious they were on creating a new life here. This was once you went across, for many of the people, they never went back. Some did, but they never went back. They never saw their relatives, their friends again. It was a choice to get a better life for them and their families. And so you have to admit that. And when they came, the main thing they wanted was land. Land to have their towns, businesses, land to have their farms. When they came out here, the relationship of the Hudson's Bay Company and Dr. Tolmie with the American settlers was complicated. And I think this is where Tolmie probably had his greatest difficulties. On one hand, many American settlers got along perfectly well with the Hudson Bay Company and Tolmie. A number of them worked for him. A number of them would come up there and get supplies from him. I think Michael T. Simmons said one time, he said, without the help of the company, we never would have made it. And he's the founder of Tumwater. So you had one side very positive. On the other side, you had, and sometimes they were the same people. That's the part I don't understand. But usually they were different people. People would come and they would say, well, I'm American. This is, since 1846, officially American territory. And it's true, the company had rights to stay there until their rights were purchased by the U.S. government. But that didn't happen for a while. So the company continued its operations, and these American settlers that had manifest destiny, the concept that this is all American territory, it was destined to be American territory, they felt simply, why the heck were these foreigners here? And why did they happen to control a lot of the good land? And so you would have people who would be working with them, and sometimes even the same people would say, well, let's get them out. And the results were a series of, I would say almost like harassment of company operations. They would try, some settlers would try to go and squat on company land. Some would try to shoot cattle, company cattle. Some company officials would, some American officials, local officials would say, well, okay, a ship came in, did you pay every tax on this thing? And they would go, this one ship, they said, well, look, there's a barrel of sugar in it. The whole rest of the thing is all legal because it's one barrel. We'll seize the ship, okay? And so Tolmie had to negotiate. He had to go to court trials. He tried to keep peaceful relations with them the best he could, and he did. It was very difficult on him. He must have been a patient man and a dedicated man to put up. And he did not really want to have conflict with them, but it came all the time. Now, the interesting thing is every time there was a local dispute, if it ever went to the federal level, the HBC would win. Because according to the Treaty of Oregon in 1846, their holdings here belong to them. Not until they sold their rights to the government could they be pushed out. One point I want to put out, in recent years there's been a lot of interest in George Bush of Tumwater. And I have to say this, we don't know what George Bush looks like. So if you see this nice picture, this is just an artist's version. I wish we had a good photograph, we don't. Anyway, he was a remarkable African-American pioneer. He worked up at the post. He met Tolmie. He was part of the, worked with the Hudson's Bay Company, just like Michael T. Simmons, just like a lot of the settlers. So that's part of our history too. Now, the thing is that the point that really tested William Tolmie came in 1854 when they had the Medicine Creek Treaty, the council. And this is a picture of what it looked like decades later from the council. Anyway, it turned out that for the American settlers, what they really wanted was the land. And so to the credit of the U.S. government, they decided to negotiate. They just didn't take it. So they had a council meeting of the U.S. government led by Isaac Stevens, first Washington territorial governor and superintendent of Indian Affairs for this area. And they met with different Native leaders. And they negotiated this treaty with, now I could give a whole talk on this, so I got to be careful on this one. But they did negotiate the treaty, but the most important thing was that the Native Americans ceded most of the land here in southern Puget Sound to the American government, who then gave and sold the land to the settlers. Anyway, the thing is, the treaty was very harsh. It was a tough treaty. It was not a fair negotiation. The consequences were immense. And with the vote decision coming up, the 50th anniversary early next year, the consequences continue. Very complicated. I don't want to get into that. But what I want to say is that with the treaty, the American settlers took really firm control of this area. But it wasn't a peaceful transition. There was a war that came out in 1855, 56. Some of the Native Americans fought against the treaty. That's why it's called the Treaty War. And so they had, on one hand, some Native Americans, on the other hand, the U.S. soldiers, but more commonly, the Washington territorial volunteers, so local territorial volunteers. It was a short war. The Native Americans lost. It was a difficult conflict, and the part was that the Fort Nisqually Tolmie is in the middle. He really, honestly, I believe he really kind of supported the Native viewpoint. But he also supported the concept of Western civilization, Western settlers and stuff too. And he had a great sympathy for them too. So he's in the middle. The Native Americans never attacked the Hudson's Bay Company people. I don't want to go into the martial law dispute and stuff, but anyway, some of the American settlers looked with great disfavor upon the company and their position of being semi-sympathetic to the Native American. Anyway, the Native Americans lost. They renegotiated the treaty a little bit to give better land to the tribes. Unfortunately, the leaders of the resistance to the Americans were captured, killed, and then executed, Leschi. And I have to admit, one thing that is famous for Tolmie and would be remarkably brave for his time period is he joined in the defense of Chief Leschi, and actively. And in the last speech of Leschi, which is quite moving, he says that his friend Tolmie said he shouldn't have fought, and Tolmie was right. Now, it's very complicated, but that Tolmie was a great friend of Leschi and supported him at this time. This was not popular at all with many people in this territory. Anyway, so after the war, the American settler pressure increased as there were more settlers here. And in 1859, Tolmie was reassigned up to Victoria, so he left. He was promoted on the board of management of the Western Department of the HBC, so pretty high up, and he ended almost being the head of that group later. He left this area, and his promotion was a reward, I think, for the work he did down here. Now, what happened to what we'll do is we'll go into what happened to Fort Nisqually a little bit, and then what happened to Tolmie. The fort itself, it took years of negotiations. On one hand, the U.S. government and the Americans would say, all the property rights of the Hudson's Bay Company in the Northwest, we're generous, it's worth, $50. I'm exaggerating. And the Hudson's Bay Company says, well, we think it's worth $500 million. So it took a lot of negotiation. They finally agreed, I think it was like $600,000, something like that. And in 1869, the U.S. government bought the rights of the HBC and PSAC down here in the Northwest. In 1870, the post closed. By this point, after Tolmie had left, Edward Huggins was in charge of it. Now, Tolmie went up, and he did not just fade away. He went up, he was active with the company, he worked with the company at a top level until about 1870. He took a furlough and then officially retired in 1871. Meanwhile, to keep himself busy, at the same time, he set up a farm there. And here is Cloverdale. There's a farmhouse, 1,000 acres. And to me, I like to think that when he worked there and managed the different people, it was like working at Fort Nisqually for him. He also was very active civically. He was in the Legislative Assembly of Vancouver Island, which was at that time an independent colony, from 1860 to 1866. And from 1874 to 1878, he was a member of the British Columbia legislature because Vancouver Island and the mainland became one colony of British Columbia. And when he was in politics, I guess you would call him a reformer. He supported wild ideas like, quite early, suffrage for women, temperance, and one that was quite popular among many people in Canada, Canadian Confederation. So that British Columbia joined what is now Canada. He heavily supported that. He was very active for his whole life, until when his wife died in 1880. And after that, he really slowed down. And it was said that he took his meals alone in his library, except for one day a year. And I think it's appropriate because it's Christmas Day. He would eat with the family. And I like this picture. It's at his family. You can see William Tolmie in the middle. His wife is to the left. And here he's surrounded by his children, some of his children. And anyway, he died on December 8th, 1886. Both Jane and William Tolmie are buried at the Ross Bay Cemetery in Victoria. And so the thing is, how do you remember someone like that? I mean, he had a great impact in this area. And you think about things named for him. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. And since he was a botanist and a zoologist, really, many plants are named for him. And you have to look for the scientific name. That's how he's named. And the piggyback plant is named for him. This warbler is named for him. Now, it used to be, and this is kind of the ironies of history, the scientific name is still named for him, but the common name was named for him. It was known as Tolmie's warbler. But then, somehow, and I did some research on this, the name changed to that name. And the funny thing is that guy did not discover the species. The specimen he had was given to him by Tolmie. So, but anyway, that's the way it goes. There's places named for him. There's different water channels up in British Columbia. But the ones that I think are the most interesting is Tolmie Peak, which is near Mount Rainier. And Tolmie Peak is famous because of its fire lookout that was built not during the time of Tolmie. It was built in 1933. And it's a really nice view I've read, and I think yeah, you told me. Yeah. So it was, it's a nice view from there. And then the other one, which I was kind of surprised, is Mount Tolmie in Victoria. And I've been to Victoria. I don't remember seeing the mountain, but you look at this, it's an impressive mountain there. One place near in Lacey area, really, is Tolmie State Park. And I remember when Del McBride named the park. he was asked for a possible name for the park, he suggested Tolmie. And you may say, well, how much did Tolmie directly have to do with that area? No. Think of the whole region he dealt with. He didn't have anything specifically to do with the Tolmie State Park area. But I think it's nice to name an actual area after Tolmie. And, you know, this is when, I guess, when you really become famous. You have a teddy bear named for you. The Hudson's Bay Company Foundation, which is a charity, does charity work up in Canada. Every year they have a charity bear. And in 2015, it's Tolmie. But I think, actually, the best way that Tolmie's remembered is at two different sites. First one is Fort Nisqually Living History Museum, because I'll keep this straightforward, but after the fort closed down in 1870, gradually the pieces fell apart. You know, the palisade was taken down, used for firewood, buildings fell apart. Eventually it was only two buildings in what is now DuPont. And in the 1930s, they were moved up to Point Defiance Park in Tacoma, and they fixed them up, and they added buildings to be a living history museum. And it really has become a living history museum in more recent decades, I would say since 1980. And this is the factor's house. So this is the actual house, real house that Tolmie lived in when he was at Fort Nisqually. And they moved it up. They fixed it a lot, and I think around the year 2007 or so, they fixed it again. And you can see groups of kids visiting and stuff. You know, the house is really alive with people. And at Fort Nisqually, they do living history. I'm sure people dress up as Tolmie as part of these events. This is their famous candlelight tour they do every October. And the other place that Tolmie, I think, is definitely remembered is at the original site, the 1843 original site in DuPont. And it is owned by Archaeological Conservancy that keeps an eye on it. But really, the people that maintain it is the DuPont Historical Society and the DuPont Museum. And this is a tour that, well, actually, I gave this tour back in 2016. And it's for Archaeological Conservancy people that came to visit the site. But anyway, the thing is, what's interesting is the site is preserved. It's very historic. It's, okay, how can you say, only open a couple times a year by guided tour. If you look at those black locust trees there, they're not the original trees, but they're descendants of trees planted by Tolmie. And at the DuPont Historical Museum is a really good display on Fort Nisqually history I recommend, and it's a place that Tolmie comes alive to. And so anyway, to conclude, William Fraser Tolmie was a remarkable person for many reasons. I definitely think he needs to be remembered. Thank you.
The Q&A button is at the bottom of the screen. And if folks have any questions, please raise your hand. I am actually going to start us off because I did have someone reach out to us to pass along a question for you. Okay. So I'm going to read it here to start. So if anyone has any questions, or start thinking of them now, because I'm going to bring the mic around. Okay, so a story has long been circulated over the years that golf was played at Fort Nisqually during the 1840s and 1850s. A Seattle Times article from March 26, 1939 describes an interview with Roy Webster, a golf historian, who related that he was told by Herbert Griggs, a prominent Tacoma attorney and historian and avid golfer, that Griggs himself was informed by Edward Huggins, Tolmie's successor, that several holes were laid out at Fort Nisqually and golf was played by HBC employees. The following is an excerpt from the 1939 Seattle Times article. way back in the 1850s, when the Hudson's Bay Company still held and operated holdings of land in these parts, it had a post at Fort Nisqually. The factor, or boss, of the post was, as most of those Hudson Bay factors, appears to have been a Scotsman, and true to the traditions of his race, he was a golf enthusiast. He had clubs and balls sent out from Scotland, laid out a half-dozen holes around the fort, and played golf with his cronies and fellow representatives of the company. My question is there any evidence in HBC's or Tolmie's records to support this claim? Is it even plausible?
The 1930s are an interesting time in history. There's lots of stories that come from that time period about earlier days. I have two answers. One is, I hope it's true. That would be a great story. Two, I've never come across any evidence for it.
Any other questions?
I guess I'm used to microphones. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned George Bush, and I know that Isabella Bush also dealt with Dr. Tolmie for not horticulture, but animal trading. I mean, she traded turkeys, got turkey eggs, and she had them hatch, where Tolmie couldn't get his to hatch, and she did. And so she'd trade that for sheep, and they just kept going back and forth for animals, and pretty soon the Bush farm was full of flocks and different turkeys and so on, all because of Isabella Bush being a good trader with Dr. Tolmie.
That could easily be
question, but
yeah, that could easily be true. The HBC PSAC records are very terse. They would not mention something like that too much. One of the hardest things is that they kept a journal at Fort Nisqually of daily entries, and for the years, I'm thinking, it's like 1840s, probably 1840s period, they're missing. They were taken as evidence for the deciding on how much to pay the company, and they were supposed to be taken up to Victoria, and they never came back. So, but no, that could easily be true. The ties between the American settlers and the HBC could be very close, There was one time, though, that Tolmie was almost killed by American settlers. And it's a strange story, but during the Treaty War, there was a woodworker, a Native American, I believe Nisqually, and he had a nickname, Indian Bob, and he was working away from the fort, and a group of territorial volunteers came by, and they shot and killed him. And when Tolmie found out, he was outraged. And so there was, I guess, another Native American with the one that was killed, and he went back to the post and told Tolmie. And so he described that the American that killed him had a kind of red shirt on, hopefully not like this. And and Tolmie rode to the camp and of the territorial volunteers, and I think it was called Camp Montgomery. And he came in and he told what happened, and he said, there's got to be justice. This guy was chopping wood, He was under our protection. He wasn't doing anything. And the militia members around him kind of came up, and they were like going to seize him. And so he pulled back and then left. And as he left, he looked, and the guy with the red shirt was inside one of the buildings, and he could see him through the doorway. And so he was there, but he couldn't do anything about it. Okay.
We do have a couple questions online. This person asks, did Tolmie have any involvement in the holding of Chief Leschi prior to his trial?
Okay. He was, okay, in a way he was against the holding of Chief Leschi. And he worked with a group of officers from Fort Steilacoom, And they had this little newspaper, I think they only did 2 issues of it, called The Truth Teller. And he was actually trying to get him released. And he was not involved. I have a feeling he did visit Leschi at the guardhouse there, but he did not participate in him being held prisoner. And one of the sad points is Leschi was held prisoner for like a year and a half. It was kind of a long term, waiting for the final justice system to how it worked out. So he did what he could to help him, but it just was not enough.
Hi, Drew. I spent a lot of years really appreciating a lot of work that you've done. It's meant a lot to me. Not long ago, thanks to Aaron, I got to read the little piece you wrote about Tyrell's Prairie.
Yes.
Since that's basically Lacey, I thought it'd be fun if you'd say a little about it. And I know that you wrote that little piece years ago, so I just wondered if you've learned anything more since about the mystery of Tyrell.
Well, Tyrell's Prairie is an area, what was known as Hawks Prairie now, but originally it was Tyrell's Prairie from an earlier American settler, Freeman Tyrell. And that was an area that the Hudson's Bay Company, PSAC, had I would say an outstation. It lasted only like a year or two, and it was near Long Lake. And I wish I could find more, but I can't. Just what I wrote was what I found. It's interesting. If we want to know more about outstations, the one that was the longest term in Thurston County and the most definite outstation was a place called Tennequa that's down by between Tenino. You cross the Deschutes River right there before you get to Rainier. And I think you have I wrote an article about it, and I think it's in Thurston County Historical Journal, and you might have a copy there. Or you can get it at a library too, that talks about the whole history of that. So yes, the HBC was very active in this area.
Okay, we have another question online. Why was the DuPont area chosen for the trading fort instead of either a site on the Deschutes River or Puyallup?
Okay, well, why was
the DuPont area chosen?
Oh, okay. Good point. It was originally chosen by Archibald MacDonald, who did kind of a survey probably about 1832 coming down from Fort Langley. And they were looking for a place kind of midway between Fort Langley up on the Fraser River and Fort Vancouver on the Columbia. And that would be on Puget Sound, had deep water port there, and he picked there. Now, he thought it was a great place. He left. The successor, Francis Heron, wanted to move it. And he moved it at one point, and this is a weird story. It's in the book, The River Runs Through It, The History of Tumwater. I wrote an essay about this. He wanted to move it down to Deschutes Falls, okay? And the point that stopped it was, first off, it wasn't a great site down here, but even more importantly, Native Americans coming down from the Strait of Juan de Fuca, from northern Puget Sound, they refused to come this far south. And when that happened, they went back up to DuPont. DuPont was kind of a key location, close to deep water, accessible by land trails and stuff. It just worked out. And the Sequelish Creek was a great source of water for them and stuff. And the local Native Americans really wanted them there. So it was an excellent location for them.
Okay, well, that is going to conclude our program tonight. Drew, thank you so much for an informative talk. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and thanks for folks for joining us online. We will see you guys in the new year in our January history talks. Thank you.